Morning all. Let's look at a historically interesting game yesterday. Magnus Carlsen, ranked 1 in the world on the FIDE rating list, was playing number 2 in the world on the FIDE rating list, Levon Aronian. So Magnus was one step away, depending on the result of this game, from dethroning Kasparov as the highest rated player ever in chess history. The round before, he had defeated McShane, and he had equalled Kasparov's rating of 2851. That peak Kasparov rating was achieved in July 1999 and 2000 of the FIDE rating list, when Kasparov was about 35 years old. Now Carlsen, he had his birthday just November the 30th, just a few days ago, and so if he could beat Levon in this game, he could break that all-time rating. The FIDE rating list, which started in 1970 with Fischer at the top for a few years until he stopped playing. Then we saw the stars like Kasparov. Korchnoi was up there a lot, but then Kasparov's domination in the 80s, which was a record domination in the history of the game. Okay, could Magnus win this game? Let's have a look at that game. Carlsen playing white, played e4. Levon played e5. Levon is known for playing very solid openings as black, and here it was no different. Roy Lopez, a6, bishop a4, and now knight f6. Russian system. d3, slightly offbeat, trying to avoid the majority of theory inclined, trying to have maybe a small but firmer advantage. b5, bishop b3, as well as going into less theoretically analysed variations. We see the aggressive move bishop c5 here. Now sometimes this move could suffer from this knight. It's able to be pinned later, but there's another point in this variation for white. White's control of d5 is quite significant here. Instead of the routine castling, which you might think, Carlsen sets his sights on the d5 square with the move knight c3. And after castling here, white would seem to have some tempting options, like bishop g5, but there's another option used instead of the routine castling, just using that d5 square here with knight d5. So very few games have been played in this line, and I believe being played before at least a couple of times has been the move h6 in this position. Levon may have been prepared for this line. He played knight takes d5. After bishop takes d5, white is now threatening, potentially, after castling especially, to just take on c6 and then take on e5. There's pressure on e5 here, with this pin being very useful as well. Rook b8, unpinning the knight. Now white castles, and he's really threatening. Bishop takes c6 and knight takes e5. And this is where it gets really interesting. Levon plays basically a gambit now. He turns this into a gambit. He gambits a pawn with knight e7, which has been facilitated by that unpinning. So what's the idea of giving up the e5 pawn here? Well, it will get rid of white's powerful light squared bishop, but Magnus goes in for it. He takes the pawn. So we see knight takes d5, e takes d5. White's lost the bishop pair. These are double pawns here, but can they be reinforced? Can white play for c4 later? Or will bc give black counterplay? There are a few questions now about this d5 pawn in particular immediately to consider. Rook e8 is played for the moment, and now d4. And the bishop now goes to f8, I believe for tactical reasons involving stuff like queen h5, but we'll check in the second part of this game. Now the threat that white is confronted with is bishop b7 for the moment. That's one of the threats, it would seem. And this next move is preparation against this bishop b7. The move b3 is played just to be able to bolster the centre after bishop b7 with c4. And indeed this is what occurred. Bishop b7, c4, bolstering the centre. d6, okay. Kicking the knight, it goes to f3. And now we see queen f6. So you might think, where is black's compensation? Well, black has some options here. Always the option of taking and using this b file, for example. This queen is putting pressure on the king side, clearly. Bishop e3 is played here. And then we see bishop c8. And a potentially nasty pin on the cards with bishop g4. Magnus sidesteps that by playing queen d2. And then we see queen g6, and now potentially on the cards is bishop h3, potentially in some variations. King h1 sidesteps that, so another prophylaxis type move against black's potential threat. h6 is played here. And now we see rook ac1. So is white actually threatening, for example, to take now and play rook takes c7, something like that? Well, actually in the game bishop e7 is played now, so we really need to check out the possibilities. What is actually going on here? Why isn't c7 on after c takes b, for example? Magnus plays actually knight g1. Potentially black could just maybe just consider bishop b7 at some point, so d5 would be weakened. So maybe that's why Magnus is not keen to go for material, but will investigate those possibilities in the second pass. So knight g1 looks like a nice rerouting of the knight potentially to f4, as well as getting out of the way of bishop g4s. Bishop g5 is played, and Magnus accepts this invitation for the exchange of dark square bishops to come off the board. Now after queen takes g5, protects the queen, and now Levon uses the option on the b file, b takes c4, and takes the queens off. So has Magnus's possibility for winning this game been evaporated by this endgame scenario where, okay, he's a pawn up but they're double pawns? Will he just have to be content with a draw in this game? Well, from the previous game he did grind down Luke McShane with fantastic king manoeuvring in the endgame. Could he do the same here in this endgame? Out of all grandmasters, he's developing a huge reputation for endgame play, and many players are starting to consider Magnus a kind of new Capablanca in a way, who is also renowned for his endgame play. What can Magnus do with this position? After a5 we see the move h3. h3 deprives black's use of g4, so making a move like knight f3 more comfortable to play without bishop g4 being a nuisance. Indeed, after rook b4 we see knight f3. And now bishop f5. Does black have sufficient play? Can black also use, for example, this a pawn for rook b2, or the a pawn be a liability on a3? c5. Now we see king f8. The king is coming into the game potentially, and now knight h2 is played, which implies a knight maneuver like this, which will be useful. Getting a knight to e3 would support d5, would support c2 for a rook c2. A general useful position for the knight to be in. Rook eb8, and we see the knight coming in via a route which it doesn't mind being exchanged off. Instead of knight f1 here, we see knight g4 instead. Okay, so this option of bishop takes g4 is on the cards, but it's refused with rook b1 instead, wanting an exchange of rooks. And the point is revealed here. If knight f1 had been played, then taking would have been pinning the knight on f1. Here the king has still got the option of king h2, so that route was very important. Same destination potentially, but the king's got h2 here, giving white the option, which he takes up, of rook takes b1. So rook takes b1, king h2. So the knight still has the option of knight e3. Will it be taken off here? Well, Levon actually keeps the bishop on for that knight and plays a4. Okay, and the knight does centralise now on e3, and the bishop just goes back. And now Magnus, renowned for his endgame play, plays king g3. Where is this king heading? Can it really be useful in this position? Rook b4 is played, and now king f3. Black's king also gets involved with king e7, and now king e2, king d7, and now this next move is designed, it would appear, against this light square bishop. If Magnus had a bishop, maybe it would be a different story here from the strategy he adopts, which is basically to put pawns now to try and block this bishop on the same colour. He plays f3. Will he be able to neutralise this bishop with later moves to shut it down? Even if he has to put pawns on light squares, can he shut down this bishop? Okay, f3 for a moment shuts off some possibilities a little bit on the diagonals. Doesn't immediately want to play f4. He's just covering up the e4 square from the bishop, which means that the knight is now freer to move if d5 isn't such a liability with the e4 square covered. And indeed, after rook b5, okay, in this position, it would seem Black's threatening to potentially win a pawn now by taking and taking again. But this move knight d1, not fearing any bishop e4 which has now been extinguished, now facilitates knight c3. So what is actually going on here after d takes c5? Knight c3 for example. Rook a5. We'll have to check that out in the second pass, but maybe just taking and then taking on a4 is the idea, where the rook is also supporting d5 there. So Levon didn't play d takes c5 here, he played actually rook b4, and here is where we get a qualitative difference in king activity. With this next move, Magnus commits his pawn structure. He plays c6 check, pawns on the same colour as the bishop, could be cannon fodder for that bishop, but the king is becoming restricted now. It goes back humbly to the first rank. It is restricted by this pawn, whilst white is playing maybe with an extra king potentially. It can run around the board still. Okay, but is this d5 going to be a liability? For example, if the f pawn moves, bishop f7, provisions have to be made to always safeguard the d5 pawn in this position. Knight c3, and now we do see f6, as though bishop f7 is always on the cards now. King e3, rook c4. I think at this point many spectators on sites like Chessbomb were indicating it should really be a draw. They're predicting a draw. Could Magnus really carve out a win from this position? Knight e2, a3. It does commit to the a3 pawn. For the moment, of course, the bishop's across that diagonal. The a3 pawn does support a rook b2 resource, which now is unveiled. So h4, as though Magnus is now interested in shutting down the bishop, for example like this, or maybe in another way. rook b4, as though rook b2 is useful. But if the bishop can be taken off this diagonal, then d3 could be useful for a rook, potentially. g4, so h5 will be played, committing the bishop to either f7 or h7. Rook b1. Now after h5 the bishop goes in this position to h7. It's still got the possibility of bishop g8 to id5. Okay, but tactically this is an awkward scenario with the bishop here and the rook potentially here for knight c3s. So Magnus is not too concerned at the moment about his d5 pawn. He plays f4. And now slightly controversial looking move, which perhaps wasn't expected by spectators of this game. The move f5 was played, and although it undermines the pawns over here, in particular the h5 pawn is starting to look vulnerable, Magnus plays g5 anyway. We see rook h1. Now knight g3, protecting h5 and attacking the rook. Rook h3. Now king f3. And white has potentially some threats if he's given time now, especially after this king move, that it may be that rook d3 could sometimes be on the cards to win this a3 pawn. Black has to be very, very careful. He plays h takes g5, and after f takes g5, that means this f pawn is tactically useful. So in this position, if it was white's move, then f4 would be attacking knight and rook. But actually Levon in this position shuts down his own bishop. He is threatened with other things as well, of course, in this position to be concerned with. In particular, white playing g6, and then maybe king f4 even if d5 is attacked. So Levon decides in this position, perhaps rather controversially, already his position looks very difficult to play indeed. The qualitative king difference, for example, as well as the rook running out of possibilities on the h file, he plays actually g6. And in this position, okay, it appears that black might be threatening g takes h5, but that's kind of ignored here. Just rook e2 is played. And it's threatening, of course, rook e8 mating. This pawn is like a mating net around the black king. King goes to d8. But now is a very, very powerful forcing sequence, which, believe it or not, and no, I didn't cheat looking at the chess bomb computer analysis, I saw this myself, that the next forcing sequence, I hope you can guess it as well, if I give you 10 seconds, or you might want to pause the video. What can white play here as a very powerful forcing sequence? If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, h takes g6 with the idea that on taking maybe this one and this one to get a very powerful h pawn. It doesn't matter about even losing d5, I believe. But after bishop takes g6, okay, rook e6 was played, but there wasn't bishop, pardon me, in this position after bishop f7, actually there wasn't rook h6 played, but rather another very interesting move, just offering the exchange g6. This is just amazing now, giving up the exchange. These pawns look absolutely winning, especially if f5 drops, then g7. The rook would be helpless to the knight, supporting g7 surely. But we'll check that in the second pass. It looks fairly visually convincing. So the bishop humbly just retreated here. And then we see g7, just keeping up the exchange offer, which can't be taken really. f4, king takes f4. It looks desperate for black now. Rook h2, knight f5. Ignoring the a pawn, Magnus is confident his g pawn is quicker than black's a pawn here. Black takes the a pawn, rook f6, threatening immediately rook f8, mating again. Rook e2, but now, okay, with black's a pawn only 2 steps away, how does white win this? Well, his next move, rook f8 check, believe it or not, causes resignation here. Magnus did it. He surpassed Carlsen's all-time rating of 2851. I believe he's now 2856, the highest ever player in FIDE history. Highest ever FIDE rated player. So why has he won this position? Why isn't there rook e8? Let's check this out. If rook e8, there's the forcing move in this position, knight takes d6, which is absolutely crushing, devastating, because white is now threatening again mate, no time for a2, because rook takes e8 is mate. So c takes d6, c7 check, king moves. Now if the king moves, or say king takes c7, rook takes e8, the pawn's going nowhere. If a2, rook a8, surely, or is that the best move even, or just rook e1? Either. So that's pretty hopeless. And if king d7, then just taking here is winning, threatening c8. So that was the end of that. Magnus has done it again. He's crunched a super grandmaster in an endgame. Let's have a look at this game again from the start to see, did Magnus have an advantage all the way with his opening slightly offbeat approach d3 here after bishop c5, knight c3, a very rare number of games now, only about 2 games I found on some databases for h6 here. But the move knight takes d5 was played, rook b8. Okay, so you might think, can actually, for those curious, can white win material here? It looks premature with the king in the centre. I think it's just asking for trouble because of stuff like, well, let's see, is it asking for trouble? Just queen d4 surely, in any case. So the threat is actually created by castling here, simply taking a knight e5. And black just willingly goes into a gamut, knight e7. The Indian likes bishop b3, and not particularly Magnus's more materialistic choice of knight takes e5. So a very interesting choice here. So after bishop b3, for example, preserving that light square bishop, which seems, you know, fairly nice on that diagonal. Pardon me. Pardon me. The move bishop e3, knight g6. White will have an advantage in this sort of position to speak of, but completely different style of game. So the style of game is really dictated now, with black having some compensatory pressure and the 2 bishops for white's extra pawn. Rook e8 was played, d4. And now maybe, is this slightly odd, this bishop f8? It was questioned, I think, by some spectators, as though that might not have been necessary. Maybe bishop b6, as the engine is suggesting, or bishop a7 potentially. Let's have a look. Bishop b6, maybe the concern was knight takes f7. What is going on here with knight takes f7? If takes, check. And your idea here is bishop g5. Only one move to protect the queen, or rook e5 looks crazy. So rook e7, rook a e1, and this is very, very painful for black. Ouch. So there's an idea of knight takes f7, which might explain why this was avoided, but in fact there's another resource available to black. Queen h4, and that eyes d4. And what is going on here? It looks a bit crazy all of a sudden, this position. Let's say knight g5, queen takes d4. Perhaps this is better than the game continuation. Queen f3, bishop b7, inviting a check. Doesn't seem that harmful. And this looks like the bishops are having a good time over here. But okay, in the game we saw bishop f8. So why, you might ask, well, knight takes f7. Why isn't that so? Why doesn't that work at all? I think the bishop's got the option of bishop e7. That's why. So check. On here, bishop g5. Well, as well as bishop e7, there's also g6 as an option here. So this would be absolutely brilliant for black. It doesn't work at all, this tactic here on bishop f8. So I assume that that's the main reason for bishop f8. If we look at a tactical threat here, well, as well as the tactical threat would seem to be, if white's given another move, the main tactical threat is knight takes f7. As well as queen f3. So bishop f8 was played, which gives Magnus time to try and bolster the centre now. So b3, and he does seem to have that small advantage, which maybe he wanted. So from the opening, so c4, d6, the knight goes back, queen f6. So he's got the small advantage, which he nurtured along queen d2, which might not be the most accurate, just superficially here, might not be the most accurate, but he doesn't want the unpleasantness of bishop g4. So let's have a look at this. Was it that unpleasant? Rook c1. Let's imagine bishop g4. Just h3. Is this really okay? This kind of position, it seems okay. And what if bishop h5? The engine likes g4 here, so maybe it wasn't such a big deal. For bishop g5, ouch. Oh dear. That'd be winning material. If black's forced to play bishop c2 or something horrible. Winning lots of material. So maybe in this position actually technically rook c1 was playable. So although Magnus might not have the technical precision of computers, he can play his endgames exceptionally well, and it doesn't matter that from an engine point of view it seems white has virtually nothing now on depth 17, virtually nothing at all with the move queen d2. It looks as though there's full compensation for the pawn. Queen g6 might not have been the most accurate though, maybe taking immediately on c4 better, but let's see. King h1, and we're still, it's as though all the moves are inaccurate here by the GMs. The engine still likes rook fc1 or rook ac1. So inviting bishop h3, not worrying about bishop h3 even. This is a risky path that engines take. King h1 looks like a more human prophylaxis move. Just extinguish the threats. Extinguish bishop h3. Why not? Just win the endgame. So rook ac1, bishop e7 was played. Now here, was c takes b5 really possible? C takes b5, a takes, rook takes c7. Now, we're checking out bishop b7, mentioning that, but you know, why give black the counterplay? I guess Magnus was not interested in this either, even though this might be a good position technically, but no, he wants to keep his centre intact. It's the human thing to do. Keep the centre intact, nurture a tiny advantage. Knight g1, bishop g5, doesn't mind taking off a couple of bishops, and white's advantage seems naturally to still be there. Nothing's gone away. He's kept his centre intact. He hasn't indulged in complications. This is one way of playing chess, riskless. Capablanca would approve. A5, Capablanca once went 10 years without defeat, and this is why. He's not giving the opponents tactical opportunities. He's not playing any lottery here. He's just banking on a better endgame. And in fact, these pawns do support a better quality king, actually, the way the game panned out, as we saw it. That, okay, the liability, though, in white's position for a while was the d5 pawn. So knight g4, the clever route. If he had played knight f1, then it makes rook b1 surely more effective in this position. White would be forced into a passive move. This might even be better for black immediately. This blows it. So for example, takes is a disaster, surely. King g1. Bishop d7 now threatens bishop b5. f4 for rook f2. This is just not needed. So Magnus's route just avoids all these complications completely. He just plays knight g4. Enough said. No counterplay. Not as much. Although the engines do like black here with rook b2. Funny enough, it looks as though rook b2 is liked in this position instead of rook b1, which was played. So let's have a quick look at this. Was this actually a blunder to play rook b1? What can Magnus do here? The tactical point is, if rook cd1, then bishop b1 is interesting. Bishop b1 or even bishop c2 to threaten rook a2. Bishop c2, then bishop g6. Okay, if we have this position again, bishop b1, let's try this. Bring the other rook down. And surely black, you might think, should be okay. The engine's screaming black's okay, surely. We have this position. A3 looks vulnerable here. What about white's infiltration of the rook? It seems black could be okay here. If knight c4 is the major threat, it can be extinguished with bishop d3, taking time to win the a3 pawn. Black seems to be okay, but so maybe rook b1 was in the game in this position a slight blunder, a slight inaccuracy. Magnus took, so a more simplified position with two rooks coming off, and Magnus does seem to have a little advantage again, which he can nurture. And the king now comes into the game. And okay, so king e2, king d7, f3. So the knight's now free to move without worrying about bishop e4. Rook b5, is it really threatening the c-pawn? Well, let's check this out now. Again, d takes c5 is liked from the engine point of view. If this had occurred, well, this is no good for white, this position. There's no knight c3, that was a hallucination. In this position, is there knight c3? Pardon me. There's rook b4 here. Takes c6. It looks as though white's pawns are kind of fragile. Like this, for example. So, okay, so what is actually happening then after knight d1? Why wasn't d takes c5 played? Looks like a little bit of indecision not to play d takes c5. It's approaching move 14. Maybe Levon was in severe time pressure. I think he was actually in time pressure here. But it looks as though d takes c5 might have been a good chance to change the course of the game here, instead of the king being so restricted on the first row. So let's just check this once more. D takes c5. So white's best here would be knight c3, rook b4, d takes c5, and now black's best c6. And here, okay, it looks fragile. You know, if takes, then the c5 pawn looks fragile. Looks as though black should be fine. d6, rook c4. Looks fragile. Okay, so this could have been an opportunity missed. So we saw rook b4 instead. So rook b4 instead, so c6 check. And now the king seems a bit squashed on the first row. It seems a passive king. This really sets the tone for the rest of the game, for the king to be kind of on the first row now. Knight c3. Okay. Some options for black. Is rook c4 possible? It looks pretty difficult now. If rook c4, which wasn't played, then knight e4 now becomes possible. And what is the threat here? King d3, just king d3. It would shield the king for king d3 to become possible. So it's starting to be difficult for black here. He plays f6. King e3. White has definite advantage, which is not going away now. Knight e2. We saw a3, which is quite committal. h4, with the idea of really blocking that bishop soon. So rook b4, g4, the bishop's going to be blocked out of the game. h5. Now if bishop f7, that might even be worse than bishop h7. Bishop f7. Let's see, knight f4. King d3 here, and now king c3 looks to be on the cards as the major threat. Or taking king c2, even better. Just taking king c2 is threatened. So rook b5. Knight e6 here. This looks unpleasant. If say rook takes d5, knight takes g7, and knight's coming to f5 here. This isn't nice. So this is an unpleasant position, to say the least. So bishop h7 was played, which may be the best move. f4. Now f5 looked a little bit dodgy. What about bishop g8? So after f5, white's advantage, did it go up? Yes, it did. For specific reasons, it's going up here. These pawns are really dangerous. So if bishop g8 was played here, then move f5 is possible. Tactically, it looks as though this is not possible because of knight c3. Let's have a look. Knight c3, and that's just winning material. There's nothing black can do there. So bishop g8, but it still might be the best move. So f5, forget taking on d5. King d8, it's very difficult and miserable with the king on the first row though. So knight f4, the knight's just coming to e6, surely. King d3 now threatens takes and king c2. Rook e2, white's doing very well here in any case. King e4. Let's go with king e4. It just looks entirely unpleasant now, this kind of position. But what would be a knockout blow? Where can the knight go? Check. Let's imagine this position. I'm pretty sure it's a pretty lifeless position for black, and maybe now actually there's a concrete way in here. If we want to just check this out quickly, let's get this a3 pawn, for example. That's pretty nasty anyway, just simply getting the a3 pawn. So let's go back. So after f5, that seems to be marking a total disaster now. After g5 of a different sort. Rook h1, knight g3, rook h3, virtually the only move to stay in the game. Because, let's see, if rook g1, then king f2 gains more time in any case. So rook h3, king f3, And now black took on g5. I think it's pretty bad for black in any case, this position. If bishop g8, let's have a quick look at bishop g8. In this position, king g2 attacking the rook. And this is really terrible, I think, now, because in this position, knight takes f5. And check, ouch, tactical check here, just winning that bishop, nasty. Oh dear, oh dear. So the tactics are really starting to favour, even with the king on c8, favouring white. So g6 was played here, sealing black's fate really. It's just a very difficult position to play, and it's probably lost in any case. But rook e2 threatens mate. And now we see hg, a forcing sequence, rook e6. So bishop f7, I thought rook h6 was great, but Magnus chose another powerful move, just as powerful really. g6. So can this be taken? I doubt it. d takes e6. Let's see how the rook stumbles in this position. Say here, knight takes f5, protecting everything, and that rook's pretty hopeless, it seems. In this position, the pawns are not going anywhere, and white plays here, for example, knight takes d6, overloading the black position. So for example, takes c7. The rook's just helpless in this position against the knight and the pawns, absolutely helpless. So I think Levon knew the writing was on the wall here. He goes for the a2 pawn, maybe not really believing this has enough time against white's threats. Off the check, knockout below, knight takes d6 is delivered, and Magnus makes history. He overtakes Kasparov on the highest ever FIDE rating achieved. Wow. I think everyone is now in awe of Magnus Carlsen. Please check out my playlist for Magnus. I have been doing a few of his games in recent weeks from the past. An amazing player indeed. I'll put a link in the description of the video or embedded in the video for Magnus's playlist. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.